I think we're finally, assuming no more disruptions, ready to get started.
Fingers crossed.
We'll let Jeanette explain our activity today.
All right, all right. So, everybody, essentially, what we are all doing, and again, forgive the sort of incongruity of what's happening here today, is as you may or may not know, did we tell them this already?
We haven't told them anything.
Oh my gosh. All right, then I get to tell you everything. We are all about to play a game of telephone together, everyone. So essentially what has happened is the group of people that left the room watched a card trick in another room. They are the people who have seen it. Essentially, what will happen is in a moment, and I'm going to run through this first, so bear with me for a brief moment. In a moment, we're going to ask everybody your chairs are already basically turned together, which is great. But essentially, the person who is sort of like person one in the chain, the people who just re-entered the room, they're going to, and don't do it quite yet, but they are going to turn to the person to their immediate right, and then keep it to yourself, keep it secret, everybody with the papers. You will end up turning to your right, telling the person to your right your description of what you just saw. And then please continue all the way down across the circle, propagating that message of the magic effect that you saw. Once we get to the last person, I'll be coming out with clipboards for whoever's the last person in the chain. I see who you are. Essentially, once we get to you, we'll be asking you to write down what you heard in your group's interpretation of the card trick that they saw. So basically, pass that message along the chain. Once it gets to the last person, I'm going to come to you with a clipboard, and you'll write down the message that you heard. Pretty straightforward. Any questions?
We should skip, I believe, the people who were the original set of spectators.
If you were the original group who saw about 40% of the card trick originally, we will kindly ask you to sit this out. So if you know that you are that person, just please, kind of omit yourself so that the person, like, for example, if it's Marilyn, like you would just say, please move to the next person. Does that make sense? Okay. Right on. Let's go ahead and get started then, everybody. Today, I am super excited to be talking to you about the idea in magic of essentially kind of minding the gap. I feel like magic does offer a really unique structure for how we can think about how magic is used and uses framing and some of these other devices to essentially create information that is maybe not quite what it seems, but in these very insidious ways. So much of magic, by its very nature, has to keep the fact that whatever sort of manufactured disinformation it is actively creating, it must be kept secret. Those mechanisms must be secret. So as a result, there's a lot of sort of the ways in which magic uses sort of opacity to be really interesting. This is a great quote out of Gustav Kuhn's lab. He's doing a lot. He's a CogSci researcher at Goldsmiths, and he is really kind of the main person in the world looking at magic as a research mechanism to study the brain. And this was a quote from a recent paper that came out of his lab, talking about, we'll kind of focus on the end here, but about how misdirection is ineffective. It allows people to see or work out the method. since a key aspect of magic is witnessing of an effect that is apparently impossible. If people become aware of the misdirection, then the impossible becomes possible. So for example, if this is actually a really funny example today. If, for example, I had, done the thing with the fabric, we cut the fabric, it gets tied together, and then say a fire alarm goes off, and then people go, oh, well, there's flashing lights, and I'm concerned, and oh, we had to leave the building, or whatever. Like there's, if you do not feel that every aspect of a process was clear and transparent and fair, then your level of belief in something plummets. If you think about the idea of, if a magician is doing something that seems, fumbly or seems in some way like you can tell, oh, I was very clearly, directed to look over here, it doesn't have the same feeling as a level of clarity. And so this is one of the things I've been really interested in, is how I feel like a lot of magic is what exists in the gaps that are filled in the mind by the perceiver. This happens through many different vehicles and different mechanisms, but one of the things we'll be focusing on today especially is the use of language and visual and language framing. But I think a lot of times one of the things that's really interesting with magic is how magicians use a very kind of refined, very subtle way of thinking about how ideas can be sort of subconsciously manufactured within the mind of the viewer based on these framing devices. And so a lot of times it is sort of this really odd combination of both what's real and unreal, imagined and perceived, and all of these sort of things to sort of create something that should be there. And sort of speaking also to some of Arvind's points earlier, is that magic sort of deals with both the implicit and the explicit in the same breath. Because a lot of times as magicians, we're having to show you something that a lot of times is either not what it seems or is incomplete in some way. Because the fact is, as much as I would love to be able to stand here and say like, oh yes, I can genuinely, make, an apple transform into an orange. Amazing, there obviously, because magic is, a technical craft, there's all sorts of shortcuts and loopholes and all these sorts of things that have to come together to essentially kind of fill in this missing part of the information. So again, I feel like this is a really interesting reason from my perspective on why magic is interesting in this way. And magic gives this sort of false sense of certainty about what you're seeing. And it's precisely this idea of trying to create this manufactured false sense of certainty that I think makes magic compelling. One of the many reasons. I feel like so much of magic is trying to come at creating and designing a visual experience using sort of this really multimodal approach of looking at the careful crafting of language, visuals, context, behavior, a lot of times material science, all sorts of things, basically to come together that a lot of times essentially are almost building up sort of a scaffolding around an empty lot. And you have the perfect outline of a non-existent building. And you need to manufacture that scaffolding flawlessly so that then essentially the perceiver is building that building inside exactly to your specifications, but it's not really there. Then what becomes interesting with magic, certainly in the way especially that we look at parallels with misinformation and disinformation, is the way that then once that building gets built within the structure of that empty scaffolding, the way that then that building changes. Because a lot of times we see something like magic that is already fantastical. It already exists with sort of outside the bounds of our typical expected perceptual events. So because you're already dealing with something that's sensational and fantastical, a lot of times if you talk to people about magic performances, they get more and more impossible seeming in the retelling. There's a lot of really fascinating historical examples of this. One of my favorites is from Max Malini, who's a magician who did this effect kind of mid-20th century, and he would make a block of ice appear. And it's really amazing when you read the historic accounts of people who were working with him and colleagues of his about the size of the block of ice that he made appear. That sounds from their accounts like it was probably about this big, versus other accounts that you hear when people are like, he made this block of ice appear on the table that was this big, you know. And so it's really interesting the way that magic, because it's already sort of so nonsensical, morphs in those ways. This is sort of coming back to a lot of what I was talking about with the scaffolding analogy of a lot of times because big chunks or important chunks of information are missing, you essentially are having to come at it from multiple different angles, where if a key piece of visual information is missing, you may have to sort of supplement that from a couple of different angles to sort of create this false, almost like cognitive support of supporting something with language, with behavior, with context, with the sort of maybe reference of another, like an audience member who's maybe validating or verifying something. So a lot of times you're having to piece together multiple forms of information, language being an important one. Many of you may be familiar with this Elizabeth Loftus study from 1974 that is based on language and memory and framing. This was something where they showed participants videos of essentially a car accident. They were framed in different ways for people. And people were basically given this different set of essentially priming, not questions, but examples, and then we're asked to determine or estimate how fast the two cars were going when they collided. And so people were either asked to, they swapped out the verbs. There's much more interesting now, more recent studies on this than adverbs that we've been discussing. But with verbs, they were asked to determine whether, estimate how fast the cars were going when they collided, bumped, contacted, hit, or smashed. So pretty obvious where this is going. These were you can see just such a wide range, obviously from the sort of most innocuous of these being contacted all the way up to smashed, and how you see such a, nearly almost, 9 miles per hour of difference sort of in those means. So I feel like this is, again, it's sort of just on a really subtle manipulation of one word that all makes sense within the context. This is something that we as magicians think about and do a lot when we think about illusions and how to end up creating something that is often to the most extreme edge of that. And then things that we also think about will then create the most extreme and fantastical and sensational retellings. And that's sort of our careful choice of language. I'm going to quickly play, and I'm going to try to do a time check as well, an audio demo for you that basically I'm going to play a 1-second clip for you. I just want you to listen for the pitch and tone changes in this little clip of electronic sounds. All right, I'm going to play the exact same clip again, but before I do, I'll just say it was a sunny day and the children were going to the park. It was a sunny day and the children were going to the park. Yeah, so for anybody who's not run up against this yet, this is sine wave speech. This is out of the lab of Dr. Diana Deutsch, who's really the world's lead authority in auditory illusions. So here she used a lot in terms of specific framing devices on how we hear audio illusions that are sort of emergent from highly digitized forms of human speech, and then how that evolves based on whatever sort of these prompts people are given, whether that's seeing an image of children in the park, auditorily hearing it, different things like that, and how that does literally morph what we hear. I will probably blow through this for the sake of time, because we we have to move forward. And also, we also fully understand and recognize that we lost about a half an hour of our time with you. So if anybody has to leave early, we totally get it. One of the things, obviously, that I already touched on was the idea of how magic baked within it oftentimes is sensational and surprising. It relies so much on our ideas of sort of the ontological commitments that we make about objects and how we understand certain objects to behave or function or material properties that they hold or things like that. And so as magicians, a big part of our job, or certainly what I am deeply fascinated in my job, is trying to have as robust and complex of an understanding as I possibly can of how every single object that ever gets used functions, and what a completely normal usage for that would be, and then how to sort of a lot of times remanufacture what a normal use of an object would be, because a lot of times that's just really not what's happening. And so as a result of that, a lot of times having sort of knowing that people are looking at things through the context we're used to seeing them in, the use cases that we're used to seeing, that's the sort of thing that then when something comes out of that that is surprising, that's a lot of times then where we try to highlight a lot of the kind of support materials of these same structures of sort of misinformation and disinformation. We know whatsoever that sort of emergent surprise will be based on ideas of expectation violation, and then that's where a lot of times we're trying to use language or these other things to create these more fantastical retellings. That's essentially kind of our little recap on how, at least for my 5 minutes, to think about how magic kind of exists in these filled-in gaps within the mind, and perhaps what it can show us about how we think about coming together and using different forms of information, and how a lot of times magic shows us how magic can be sort of how information can be created purely within the mind of somebody looking to not have explicit disinformation being created, because a lot of times that is something that immediately, we see as not credible. If anybody wants any of our slides or anything, please get in touch. Right now, I will show you. You all have heard in your different groups your kind of perceived idea of what the magic effect was that the 6 people saw. I will show you exactly what they saw, within the caveat that, of course, this is, an hour later and it's different, it's a different room, etc. But I'll do the same effect again, just so you can see what those 6 people originally saw. I'd love to have somebody else join me. Let's keep this variable consistent. Lily, you were with me before. Would you join me again? Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you so much. All right, fantastic. So I chatted with your group and the group prior about how I have been a magician literally my entire life, and I grew up learning a lot about card magic and playing cards, and even now have a lot of people in my orbit who are expert card workers. And so this comes up in a lot of conversations, even to this day, oftentimes of sort of learning little odd things about playing cards and pieces of trivia. So I know especially in we had our initial group of 6 who watched the effect, got halfway through, so we swapped everybody out. But I know in that initial group, we had Marilyn, who's an amazing mathematics instructor who's done a lot of work on the use of mathematics as a teaching tool, specifically related to arithmetic. Am I remembering that? And algebra, apologies. So kind of thinking about these things. So as we were kind of sitting talking, I had this little mental aside of something that may perhaps have been relevant to share with people. It's a little like fun fact about playing cards. So Lily, let's imagine you and I were playing a game. I just counted out 10 cards and I said, all right, here's 10. And if you want to double check right at the beginning of a game that you're starting with the correct number of cards, here's kind of this new way I learned how to do this recently, is take your first card, turn it face down, put it on the bottom. That's 1. Second card face down on the bottom, that's 2. Lily, starting with 3, would you count off the rest? Make sure we have 10. 2, or sorry, we're at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Perfect. So it was more relevant in our first group, and honestly, this is more relevant for some card games more than others, but I had this little mental aside and thought I would share. But while you're here, I'm really hoping you will help me with this piece of magic to show for everybody. Yes? Okay, amazing. I'll have you hold those 10 cards, one hand on the top, one hand on the bottom, and hang on to it just like that. Fantastic. Thanks for coming. So I'll grab 1, 2, and 3 cards from my deck. If I take the first of the 3 and give it a little bit of a squeeze, the first one vanishes. That leaves us with just 2. Now, sometimes, not always, the second one will go a little bit faster, and that leaves us with just 1 card. In this case, it looks like it's the 4 of diamonds. What is your name? You have a gray hoodie on? Hannah. Hannah, it will be your job to keep your eye on the 4 of diamonds, okay? Okay, great, fantastic. Okay, yes, we good? Okay, fantastic. All right, Hannah. And if you would, actually here, let's do this. Here we go, 1, 2, 3. All right, so just like that, the 4 vanishes as well. Now, probably only means one thing for you. If you would, just deal down your cards onto the table for us, one at a time. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. Round of applause for Lily, everyone. Oh, wait, no, come back. Okay, so Hannah, you are probably wondering and thinking the same thing I am, which is, I know that 4 of diamonds, it is on my mind. Would you please put me at ease for like 2 seconds? Would you just kind of spread apart the couple of cards there? Oh, would you show it to everybody? Hold it up, show it to everyone. Okay. If you would, go ahead, please take the 4, put it back on top. Oh, you've already done so. Go ahead, grab all 13 cards, and then just go ahead, hold them in your hands like you did before. 1 hand on the top, 1 hand on the bottom. Fantastic, thank you. We'll try something similar, but with a little bit of a twist. Ready? Here we go. One more time, please deal your cards down onto the table. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. Round of applause for Lily, everyone. Thank you so much. All right, so that is what the group saw in the other conference room. So every single person in this room has heard very different interpretations. I read the papers. You all have seen very different interpretations. And we may have to refresh this. Yes, here we go. We have very different interpretations of how that looked. Give me a brief moment, and here we go. All right, so group 1 was the magician shows 10 cards. Oh, this was the end result, apologies. Group 1 was, I saw a magic trick. The amount of cards was increasing without the person who was holding it holding a move. The number of cards started with 10, then 13, then 17. I was impressed. Oh, thank you. And then here was the end result. The magician shows 10 cards. First person sees 16 cards. A second person sees fewer cards. How many cards were there? Unclear. Okay, second group. Change number of cards in participants' hands, and it makes a particular card appear in the participants' hands. And so that was the first one. The second one was she had a plain card in her hands. Fascinating. All right. Group 3, a magician, actually I have the physical ones here, which is going to be easier for me to read off of. Magician moves cards into a volunteer's closed hands without being close. Each time the volunteer counts the cards, there are more than before. And that morphed into, the magician will show a card to the audience without touching the card. Its value will increase from 10 to 13 to 17. And group 4 was, so this was you, Lily, I assume. I was holding 10 cards. Jeanette did not touch me ever. I then counted out 13 cards from the original 10, then was holding all the original 13 cards, and I counted out 15. Somehow the 9 of spades came from Jeanette's pile into my group of 13. And then that changed into a magic trick with 10 cards, and the 9 of spades is missing. After the magician shows the cards, and the 9 of spades appears as one of the cards, but no cards were added or removed. Group 5. Magician asks one member of the audience to hold 10 cards, and in the first round demonstrated that there were 13 cards. In the second round that there were 17 cards, including a card that was shown to be in the magician's hands right before counting. Also, whoever wrote this has gorgeous handwriting. And then that changed to, it's a card trick that involves covering something and showing something, and no one knows the details. Group 5 nailed it. And group 6, magician gave 10 cards to an assistant and then counted, and there were 13. There was the 9 of spades disappeared from the magician's hands into the assistant's deck, and then counted again, there were 17. That changed into, magician has 10 cards to start. He or she asks the audience to take 2 cards, 13 are left, takes another 2 cards, 17 are left. So obviously, we're seeing, I think, a pretty clear demonstration of how we're starting with something that is outside of the bounds of our normal experience. We have this very sort of fantastical, sensational event where, despite what you may feel like you saw, pieces of information were missing there. You obviously were not seeing everything that was happening. There were things I was doing that you weren't seeing, and unbeknownst to her, and hopefully to you, there was things that Lily was doing that she didn't even know that she was helping me do. And so we're seeing this big spectrum of how those initial things were how the effect was interpreted by the initial group, but they were sort of in a semblance of similar things, and then how they morphed. What we didn't tell you guys, I think I can reveal this now, is that every single person in that initial group, the people who you probably heard me say all got the envelopes to go to a separate room, every single one of those people got a different prompt. They basically got a different priming piece of information that ended up playing out in some interesting ways. So here were the framing devices that we used. Was group number 1. You guys had a prompt which was to pay close attention to the magician's words. Group number 2 had a prompt to pay close attention to the magician's hands. Group number 3 had a prompt to pay close attention to the volunteer's hands. That's actually what we see come through that prompt, is actually what came through most clearly in the end retellings. Then we also, because this is sort of a live experiment for us as well, in our own collaboration and research, was we were interested in things that were much more attentional and attention-based and sort of logistical and straightforward versus things that were more narrative. So then the latter 3 were that this was one of the first tricks that I learned as a little girl. That is not true. Sorry. This is a technically sophisticated trick that I've only ever shown to a tight circle of other magicians. Sorry, also not true. And that I was banned from Las Vegas for using this technique. Also not true. But so we were really interested to see the ways in which how these came about and what was shown about these. So the one thing I'll reflect on quickly, and then I know we were going to kind of jump in on this together. But the one that I thought was the most interesting was the groups 2 and 3, which especially 3, which was asked specifically to look and pay attention to the volunteers' hands. And that was the one that came through most clearly, of saying the magician moves the cards into the volunteers' closed hands without being close. So not only were they noting their hands, but they were noting our physical proximity, and the way that the volunteer counted the cards. So we saw that, and then we also saw, again, here, even in the retelling, that idea of the audience member still came through in the retelling. So I think it's interesting as we kind of look at and reflect on how different aspects of what was kind of shown ended up coming out through those end retellings and what the initial people were asked to focus on.